Whenever y'all are ready to start, we're good to go.
Yeah, can everyone hear me? Judge, can you hear me?
Yep, I've been able to hear everybody.
Awesome, great. Then we'll just get started. Let me just get my phone to time myself. We're proud to affirm. We believe that before we get into debating the merits of a rule such as this, that we have to notice the context in which we operate. We believe that we are members in an elite group of higher education, one that is traditionally inaccessible to minorities, and we have a special need to implement policies that uphold standards of diversity. Before we even argue about the efficacy of this rule, which we'll call the Rooney Rule based on the NFL policy, we have two claims. First, that regardless of the successes of this rule in diverse hiring, it is only by starting with standards about hiring practices that we can reach true equality and more stringent hiring regulations. For example, since the NFL implemented the Rooney Rule for head coaches and senior operations in 2003, they have voluntarily expanded the rule to include offensive and defensive coordinators, and programs must now interview at least 2 minority coaches, and they now incentivize internal development of Black head coaches with draft picks. This happened because the Rooney Rule began a conversation about diverse hiring that has continued into the present and led to further reform. That is to say, no individual hire is going to change the world, but starting the conversation and starting the practice here is the only way to get substantial changes. Secondly, we believe that the ACC is a predominantly Southern sports league that's institutions were frankly built physically and economically on the backs of Black slaves. Duke, Carolina, Clemson, UVA are all examples. We believe that there are 4 tenets to reparative justice, and this policy helps our institutions to make up for the injustice of the past. First, we think that it is abundantly clear that Black people have been systemically used and minorities have been systemically disenfranchised throughout all of history. Secondly, we believe that injustice is still relevant today. That is to say, the unpaid labor that went into constructing our institutions helped disenfranchise and continue cycles of poverty amongst Black Americans. Thirdly, not only are Black people discriminated against nationally, but we think that our institutions commit racist acts of violence constantly. Look at the racism towards a George Floyd monument at Duke, Notre Dame's silencing Black experiences, and hate speech at UMiami. Our institutions are all actively continuing this violence against Black bodies and are culpable. And lastly, we believe that this policy would help undo some small part of that injustice. That is to say, it would help launch Black and minority bodies into higher paying positions with more authority within our institutions, helping in some part to undo the bad that has happened. We believe that regardless of what actually happens in diverse hiring practices, passing the Rooney Rule is an important step in the right direction. Now getting into the rest of the debate, let's start arguing about whether or not we believe the Rooney Rule would lead to more diverse hiring in general. We think there are 3 main reasons we believe that you're going to lead to more diverse hires and more minority head coaches on our side of the house. First, we think we are quite simply more likely to give more job offers to minority people. The simplest argument is that it is more likely that a Black or minority person is interviewed, clicks with their interviewer, and gets hired for a position they may not have been considered for otherwise. We believe that with the Rooney Rule, this just simply happens more often. Not only that, we believe it is just more likely that the percentage of people who are going into interviews are going to be minorities who get into interviews are going to be more successful. We believe that when exposed to more minorities, it is easier to hire those minorities. Exposure theory claims that the best way to break down racial barriers is to expose people to one another. Without a Rooney Rule, it is likely that Black people or minorities are very seldomly brought into interviews. With one, it is more likely that a search committee meets at least one Black person because they simply have to, and they are more likely in small increments to learn to dismantle their subliminal biases. That is to say, by being forced to consider Black applicants, you're more likely to see all Black applicants as viable options for the job you are hiring for. Studies have shown that seeing more even just seeing more photos of minorities before being asked your opinion on those minorities improves the way that people help perceive those minorities. More interviews with Black candidates break down biases and can lead to important hires. Secondly, we think having more Black people in interview rooms lead to them being considered more seriously for positions. That is to say, that when we have Black candidates who are more constantly being interviewed, we help break down subliminal biases within interviewers to start considering all minorities as valid. Secondly, we believe we develop Black people into the spaces they need to be to succeed. Firstly, we think that when we get minority candidates get their foot in the door, this leads to like more professional development. That is to say, when I have a job interview, even if I don't ultimately get that job, I'm able to learn things from that job interview. Because like I'm able to practice soft skills, I'm able to make connections that might lead to a different position later on down the line. We professionally develop Black people and minorities just by having them be interviewed more. And secondly, we believe that we shift diversity from being an afterthought into the front of the conversation. We believe that we lead to like more discussions about like developing professional Black people, developing people within programs, and on net we lead to just like more happenings that are going to lead Black people into being into more important positions. And the third reason that we end up with like more diverse hires is that we're the only way to lead to long-term systemic change. We believe, firstly, that hiring just one minority person in a position of power can lead to long-term changes for that entire program. That is to say, hiring one Black athletic director, for example, can lead to all sorts of assistant coaches being hired by that athletic director. We believe that minorities are more likely to launch other minorities forward into their same spaces when they're in positions of power because they're less subject to subliminal biases and things like that. And secondly, we think we create a really important precedent for other sports leagues. Let's say if the ACC passes a Rooney Rule, and as we're having this conversation, quite simply because the Western Consortium also passed something similar to a Rooney Rule, that means we start other sports leagues in the NCAA and even outside of that to have conversations about their hiring practices. We leading to like much more more change across the nation. For all these reasons, we believe that the Rooney Rule has quantifiably worked in the NFL in two ways. First, we think you had more Black coaches being hired. That is to say, we jumped from the total amount of Black coaches in the NFL, jumping to 22% up from 6% prior to the Rooney Rule. And secondly, it has increased the rate of Black hiring. That is to say, the minority hiring rate has jumped up nearly 13% since the implementation of the Rooney Rule. This evidence suggests that having a Rooney Rule increases the amount of minorities who are hired. Quite simply, this debate is about two things. What is the right thing to do and what leads to more diverse coaching? For these reasons, we're super proud to affirm.
Okay, I think I crossed you for 4 minutes. Pretty sure. Okay, with that, is there anybody not ready? Okay, cool. I'll start the time now. Okay, so my first question is on the like when we're talking about like AF ground, y'all only get to feel that there is an interview, not that there is a hire, correct?
Yeah, it's only about interviews, but we think that inextricably, when you have more interviews, you're more likely to get more hires, which are the three reasons we explained in our argument.
Okay, so then how do we like bypass, like how as the app do we bypass this concept of like compliance candidates where like in 2004, like let's look at Nick Saban, like for the Miami Dolphins, like he was brought in after the Rooney Rule was passed as a compliance candidate, so the like Dolphins didn't get fined, so they had to interview like a person of color. Like how do we bypass that in the world of the app so we don't like just tokenize Black people to like meet some sort of like standard?
So we think that we actually deal with this with our exposure theory argument. That is to say, when you're simply meeting more minority people and more Black people, you're more likely to help break down that bias. So if I, as an interviewer, only bring in a minority to tokenize them, right? But I have a really good conversation with them and click with them, there is some increased chance that I might actually consider hiring them. Furthermore, we actually give minorities and Black people more opportunities to become that qualified candidate to get them outside of the token of like diverse interview, right? So if I allow minorities to practice interviewing and I allow them to be a subject of the conversation in hiring practices, this means we're more likely to end up getting a job at the end of the day.
Okay, so you're saying it's the fact, so I just for clarification purposes, you're saying that one, it's exposure theory, like that's like the warrant of your case that like leads to hiring, correct?
So I think we broke it down in three ways. Exposure theory is the first one, and I think that's the one that deals best with the token argument.
Okay, so in addition to that, like let's look at this, like we can both agree the Rooney Rule is essentially like what we're talking about here. So when we saw the Rooney Rule, you talk about a 22% increase and like minority hires. What is that number, like outside of the percent?
Outside of the percent, off the top of my head, I'm not super sure. I would say I think there are a couple hundred head coaches in the NFL, so maybe like I don't know. I honestly don't know the NFL super well, but I would
Okay,
imagine probably a handful.
Okay, that's fine. So Nicole is going to read you a piece of evidence when she reads like our case that says that since 2011, like when we established the Rooney Rule and we look at 2011, it's only been 4, and that's still the same in the status quo. So
I mean, we're talking, if it's only 4, then we're talking about a relatively small pool, right? That doesn't suggest any evidence to actually reject the Rooney Rule
you can
either.
look at the evidence, it's super comprehensive, but I'm just going to move on to the next question. So with that being said, when we look at like the net benefit, I guess you could say, of the plan, the net benefit is just increasing the amount of like minority hires within the ACC.
Yes, that's
or is
the
there like
objective.
standalone? Okay, so then how do we quantify it? Is that just like, are we like gonna vote for the team? Like, what's the, I guess, role of the ballot criteria? Like, are we voting for the team who has the most amount of minority hires, or how should the judge evaluate the round?
So firstly, I think when we start engaging with like trying to put numbers on things, that's going to really degrade this debate a huge amount. I think we should be talking about whether or not we think these rules are effective and not just looking at the numbers that come from the NFL, because honestly, there's like a huge amount of factors that go into stuff like this. And these numbers are never going to be super comprehensive if you're telling me that the amount of people we're talking about is like 30 something, right? Like that's just not a statistically significant sample pool. But I think the way it should be evaluated is whether the judge believes you have more of a chance at creating diverse hires on our side of the house or on yours. And secondly, I think we should also be talking about what is the right thing to do. We should be evaluating whether or not we should have standards about the people we're interviewing and the people we're hiring generally.
Okay, sounds good. We only have 10 seconds left, so I'll just stop time. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, is everyone ready? Okay, 6 minutes on the clock. Oh, quick off time. I'm gonna start on their case and then I'm gonna go to the neg. All right, anybody have any questions or can I start?
Real quick, did a judge just leave his Zoom call?
Wait, sorry, what? Did you say something?
I'm still here.
No, okay. Okay, cool. So with that, I will begin. Grace and I negate resolved ACC member institutions should adopt a rule requiring them to interview at least one minority candidate for all head coach and athletic director openings for the Division I sports programs. Starting off with the affirmative, just a quick kind of overview sort of response. It should be realized that my opponents are making the assumption, they kind of jump from A to C when they say, they make the assumption that interviewing directly leads to hiring. In order to have access to any of their really, really good consequences and their impacts that they tell you in the affirmative case, in the end, the 3 things, long-term systematic change, breakdown biases, and exposure theory, that they need to prove that not just interviews are happening, but these people are getting hired. They have to prove that they're actually getting their foot in the door. For example, I would say that like when we talk about exposure theory, they're saying that like this exposure theory is the way that they solve or at least alleviate the problem of having like less head coaches in Division I sports, but there are no material impacts that we can see from this. But we're gonna get more into that actually when we get into our case. So moving on to the negative. In the status quo, no legislation has significantly increased the hiring of minority candidates for head coach and athletic director openings. For example, Solo in 2011 states that the NFL instituted an anti-discrimination policy, the Rooney Rule, which requires NFL teams to interview at least one minority candidate anytime their head coaching position comes up. Since the Rooney Rule's establishment, the number of African-American head coaches among the 32 NFL teams has increased from 2 to 6. The disadvantage to the affirmative case is interviewing itself. And the reason for this is because of the disadvantage of tokenization. We provide the following definition. Tokenization is defined at Vanderbilt University conference in 2018 in the following way. Tokenization is the practice of doing something only to prevent criticism and give the appearance that people are being treated fairly. Harvey in 2012 demonstrates that Black men performing high status work experience what she calls partial tokenization, where they enjoy some, but not all of the benefits associated with being male in predominantly male workspaces while still experiencing some of the negative consequences of racial tokenization, co-opted to promote agendas that maintain the status quo. Collins in '07 illustrates how instituting a quota for interviewing creates a level of tokenism across minority candidates. Specifically, enforcing teams that have essentially selected their new head coaches already to conduct these interviews, the NFL seems to support and perhaps mandate the demeaning phenomenon of tokenism. Instead of being taken seriously, these token candidates are likely to become future pawns, cast out in front of the media as legitimate possibilities when in reality, they are merely compliance candidates. For example, like when Grace said, in 2004, the Miami Dolphins delayed hiring Nick Saban, a Caucasian, as white head coach when someone in the organization recognized the team would be fined if it did not first interview a minority candidate. Thus, you have to reject the affirmative plan of interviewing at least one minority candidate and instead prefer the counter plan. ACC member institutions should adopt a rule requiring them to hire at least one minority candidate for all head coach and athletic director openings for their Division I sports programs. The advantage to the counter plan is you're going to guarantee minority coaching talent because we skip that middleman of interviewing. Well, there'll still be interviews, but there are 3 impacts to increasing minority talent. The first, like the affirmative, is a kind of professional spillover. Diversity in collegiate sports is a stepping stone of diversity in professional sports. Paler in 2020 writes that there is no shortage of Black men who are qualified to become head coaches in the NFL. In the NCAA, things are more dire. 10.3% of Division I head coaches were people of color, similar to the percentage of minority NFL head coaches. When you look into it deeply, there's not a whole lot of coaches coming up through the ranks that we're able to vet, prepare, promote for these jobs when they become available. The second is political activism. Diversity in coaching encourages further activism from student athletes. Druckmann et al. Can argue in 2019 that the landscape of sports is rapidly changing. This is clear when it comes to college athletics. Whether and to what extent it is appropriate for student athletes to make political statements is a thorny issue. They represent a team in a school, and the lack of diversity among college coaches is a matter of beliefs. Coaches' public statements can influence student athletes' expectations, race, as well as other ideology, gender, and other attributions likely plays a crucial role in how coaches navigate the politicization of sports. The coach and student athlete relationship is of critical importance for understanding contemporary politics. And third is inspiring future coaches. Johnson in 2017 writes that when the people with power look like you, it's easier for you to see yourself in their shoes one day. That's not the case in college football, where Black men are only 14 head coaches in the football bowl subdivision. A white, or otherwise known as FBS, a white player's pipeline to becoming a head coach is different. There are systemic barriers to entry. We can't analyze diversity at the head coaching level unless we analyze the steps throughout the most common paths toward a head coaching career. Black players have historically been steered away from positions that are direct lines to coaching jobs. The most visible example is Black quarterbacks being moved to less central positions. It's not often that you don't find a coach who didn't play quarterback. For these reasons, it's integral that you reject the affirmative and vote for the negative.
Are you ready for crossfire?
Yeah.
We're just going to run down the case. So firstly, would you rather be a token interview or not interviewed at all?
I would say, I think it's like way more nuanced than that. But I don't think it's like a fair question to ask. I would say I'd rather be
nuance then. Like, what's the more nuance to it?
I mean, we specifically outline in our case that like tokenization is especially harmful when there are no end results, like a hire.
Okay, but once again, isn't there just objectively more chance of a hire if you were interviewed in the first place?
Okay, so
like, we can argue about how much of an increase that is for sure, but isn't there just some increase if you were interviewed at all?
I would say that like with the material impacts that we've seen, that we've presented on both sides, when it comes to the Rooney Rule, no, not really. There isn't even that much of an increase.
I don't want to like talk just in general. Do you have more of a chance of getting hired for a job you were interviewed for, or a job you were not even like brought into?
Yeah, I understand, but what I'm saying is it is more nuanced than that, especially when we read to you in case.
Okay, sure. I want to ask about these numbers then. So can we talk about the hiring rate rather than the number? You say that there have been 4 Black coaches who have been hired since the implementation of the Rooney Rule, right? What rate have you not seen an increase in the rate of minorities who are getting offers while the Rooney Rule has been passed?
Okay, so what I would say, so first of all, this is the number that we read to you, I think is like, so it's an NFL number, right? The NFL has a lot more than the ACC, right? Because there are 15 ACC member institutions, right? So, and there's 32 NFL teams. So like, I would say that the rate would apply differently, but even, okay, well, let me ask you this, like, what would the rate be?
Well, I think we can't tell you a number because obviously there hasn't been like a comprehensive study, and neither of us are statisticians, so it's not right for us to just start citing false numbers. But we think it is objectively true that there's been an increase in the rate of people, like minorities, who have gotten offers since the implementation of the Rooney Rule in the NFL. But I hear your point. I'm sure Gavin will engage with it. To ask about this counter plan then, first, how can you just fiat that if we don't implement a Rooney Rule, we're going to implement some quota system?
Okay, so Grace and I mean, we're operating in like the bounds of this debate where we are allowed to have a counter plan, right? We're basically saying that like the Rooney Rule, we're rejecting the Rooney Rule entirely, which is the rule of requiring to interview. Instead, we would have another rule. I mean, you can call it what you'd like, but it's a rule where they're required to hire a minority coach.
Okay. So first, why is it likely that ACC schools would pass this policy? Like, why would they ever have this quote?
That's like a really good question. I would say that like it might be a little difficult for us to kind of engage with how likely the ACC is to go ahead and pass this legislation. Like, how likely are they to pass the Rooney Rule? But I mean, I think it's educational for us to kind of debate in this way. And also, I don't know, like there's like a big movement for racial justice. I would say the likelihood is like better now than it was even just a year and a half ago.
So we think the issue with using a counter plan, right, is that we think it is more likely when you pass a Rooney Rule that we end up reaching something like a quota, right? But we think, unfortunately, like for the terms of this debate, if you just say we shouldn't pass X policy because we would rather Y policy, that ignores a lot of the nuances of the way policies build upon one another and the way we lead to like larger conclusions in diversity hiring policies. We think that you're skipping a lot of the steps that would be necessary. And we think it's not really fair to force us to defend against quotas when we should be talking about the merits of a Rooney Rule, whether or not they're effective, whether or not this is like an on-net good
Okay,
thing.
so if that's your argument, we are 100% engaging with those nuances, right? The entire top of our case explicitly tells you the disadvantage to the Rooney Rule interviewing quota itself, and then we offer you an alternative. I don't think that it decreases the educational value of this debate, but that's time.
All right, is everyone good to go? Oh. Good? Sorry about that. All right, I got my timer, we're good to go. All right, and starting now. Okay, structure is gonna be very simple. I'm just gonna go down their case, do some cross-application and engagement. All right, so they present you largely 2 things in their round, or 3 rather. Sorry, they start off with just saying that interviewing does not equal hiring, right? They sort of just miss like all of the nuance, all of the warrants we give you for why like interviewing makes hiring more likely. Like we agreed, like not every time minority coaches interview, they're going to be hired. We think that it's like largely gloss over like a lot of the like nuance that we give you. We're gonna engage with that a little bit later on in my speech. So what are the 2 like pieces of positive material they give you? First is this argument about tokenization, right? They tell you the minority coaches are more likely to, are just going to like brought in because they're like, the teams have like already picked out who they're going to hire, right? A couple of issues there. One, we will concede the fact that some programs have already chosen their coaches. The Rooney Rule really isn't for them, right? We think a lot of programs legitimately going through a hiring process, not sure who they're going to choose, and putting a minority body in the room to have as an option, we believe is on net positive. We agree there are always going to be some programs that try to skirt the rule. We think like just because there are a couple of examples of programs doing that does not mean that is the holistic trend in the NFL. Like they only give you like 1 or 2 examples because there's like aren't that many examples of teams like giving like a completely like in no good faith search. Second, look to the actual statistics in the NFL we provide. What we show you is that the minority hiring rate has increased since the passage of the Rooney Rule from 6% to 20%. That is a significant increase. Moreover, what we say is that Black candidates who are interviewed for jobs are more likely to be hired. Why is that such a key response? Because if tokenization were true, what you would expect is the rate of Black hiring to go down, right? A lot of Black candidates are brought in, but never seriously considered. In fact, the opposite is true, as Black candidates who are being interviewed are actually more likely to be hired than Black candidates were when they're interviewed prior to the passage of the Rooney Rule. Why is this? The warranting is clear. We explain that when it becomes standard to interview Black candidates, they're considered a legitimate option rather than just like a diverse, rather than like some diverse option that isn't legitimate consideration. It changes the mental framework, right? They tell you at the end of their speech that you see like a lot of times that coaches are just seen as like particularly like head coaches like as white leaders. Like that is a consistent racist narrative that goes into coaching. When Black people are consistently considered for these coaching jobs, that fundamentally shifts the narrative. That is the warranting for why I've seen this statistic, like this large statistical increase, right? Third, we think again, you're decreasing tokenization because Black candidates are considered, right? And let's just say that you don't buy any of that and you still believe like Black candidates are just brought into interviews and like never really considered like a majority of the time. We will say that is still an on-net positive thing because as Nick explains, we believe it is a good thing for professional development to get in these interview rooms, right? We think that like the soft skills required to get like an NFL head coaching job like are probably just as important as your actual qualifications on the field. We think that if both sides are going to argue that this is necessary, like probably a somewhat racially biased hiring policy, it is incredibly important to ensure that Black candidates have as much professional development as possible. We believe there is far more of that on our side of this debate. Next, they give you this counter plan, right? What do they tell you? They say that instead, what we need is a quota. We would just say like off the top, today's debate isn't just they can implement whatever other policy they say like is better, like whatever they say is better, right? This isn't a policy debate round. We're just debating a topic. Like they don't just need to insert, like they can't just insert a counter plan. But if you can insert a counter plan, you have to prove a couple of things, right? Not just that any magical policy is better, but that this policy actually has some chance of being implemented and the Rooney Rule takes away its political capital. But let's look at the actual probability that the ACC implements this sort of quota-like policy they're talking about, right? In June of this year, the NCAA struck down the Rooney Rule. What does that mean? That a policy that we both sides agree like does less for racial hiring is already not being passed in the NCAA. What do we say? Like on our side of the house, we absolutely have like fiat power. What we mean is like when you pass this resolution, the Rooney Rule goes into effect regardless of whether it's what the ACC wants or not. But insofar as the ACC has not voluntarily implemented a racial hiring metric, they have no proof that you're going to see that being implemented in a world in which the Rooney Rule doesn't pass. They can't just say like if we were debating some issue about like taxes, they can't just say like a UBI better solves universal basic income has no political feasibility. It's the exact same case debate, right? They're presenting some magical policy that might be better, but is unlikely to pass in their world. But let's look to why the Rooney Rule actually makes this policy more likely to pass. That's the analysis that Nick provides you at the top of our case. We tell you that in the NFL, since the implementation of the Rooney Rule, they have recognized that more needs to be done to further racial hiring policies, which is why in 2009, they expanded the Rooney Rule to include like more, front office positions. And in 2020, they expanded the Rooney Rule yet again to make sure that you have to interview 2 minority coaches and have included for offensive and defensive coordinators as well, right? For all these reasons, we think the only way they're going to lead to like long-term positive change is by beginning the conversation with the Rooney Rule. If you strike down policy on racial equity and hope that better policy comes around, that better policy will never come. And the same cycle that has continued to discriminate against Black and brown coaches will continue. On their impacts, we agree with all of them. I think both teams clearly want to see which side of the debate can bring more minority coaches to the table. For all these reasons, very proud to be on side affirmative.
Okay. Alrighty. Is everybody ready for cross? It's 4 minutes. All right, awesome. I will start now. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to address this debate about whether or not a counter plan can happen in this debate space. Why can't we run a counter plan specifically?
So to run a counter plan, you have to prove that there is feasibility of this counter plan actually happening, right? Just saying that a better policy exists is not a reason not to implement this policy. Now, saying that this policy would make it less likely for the better policy to be implemented, you could argue, right? But insofar as we show there's no chance your better policy is actually going to be passed, And our side of the house is the one that actually makes it more likely for a quota system to be implemented. You have no ground to stand on.
Okay, so like let's talk about like fiat power and whether or not it can like pass or not, right? So did you yourself not say that like the NCAA rejected the Rooney Rule?
Yes, this resolution is whether the ACC should have a Rooney Rule. Thus, we get fiat power for whether or not a Rooney Rule is implemented in the ACC.
Okay, so how does it make sense? Like, why can't we say that like something is going to happen when you can't like legitimately prove that the ACC would ever like choose to implement this Rooney Rule?
Because we don't have a political feasibility burden on our side of the house. When a resolution says something happens, it happens. If you're going to argue something else happen, there has to be an actual chance of that something else happening.
Okay, so this isn't parliamentary debate, right? Like we're debating like this sort of civic, it's not, right? We're debating this sort of like civic debate. And then you also say like, it's not a policy debate, but is the Rooney Rule not a policy?
I meant policy in terms of the like particular type of debate style where you can just interject a counterplan. But even in a policy debate round, you still have to prove that counterplan has political feasibility. Insofar as you provided no evidence this has any chance of passing, you can't just say there's a better policy. There's always going to be a better policy.
Okay, so like let's talk about like the feasibility of your argument, right? Or actually no, like let me move on real quick because Grace will like get into that. Let's talk about evidence, right? You say Grace and I can't run the counter plan because we don't provide any evidence, right? So where do you say some sort of statistic somewhere, but where do you actually quote any sort of evidence?
Yeah, so I'll pull it up right now. It's a University of Chicago professor who did an analysis of the effect of the Rooney Rule, and he found that the rate of Black hiring increased. That is what I said, right? The Black candidates who are interviewed are more likely to be hired than they were prior to passing the rule, even though more Black candidates are being interviewed.
Okay, so like let's talk about like tokenization, right? Do you reject the like harms of tokenization?
No, what we would say is that the examples in which tokenization occurs are fairly small, and we think that there are benefits to go along with those harms, right? We think, like we've proven, that going into that interview process, even if you're not a legitimate consideration for that particular time, is going to lead you to like developing soft skills that'll be important in the future when you're considered by a team that like actually has like racial hiring interests in mind.
Okay, so like when the judge is evaluating this round, how should they evaluate this round? Should they evaluate this round based on who can guarantee the most like diversity hires?
I don't know what you mean by guarantee. Your side guarantees nothing. What we can tell you is we get people in the door, right? Then we tell you that once the Rooney Rule is passed, getting people in the door makes it more likely than we hire. This is quantifiably true and logically true, as we demonstrate that. Like,
so like let's talk about like your quantifiably true arguments. First of all, I would really like for the judge to realize that they've never read to you like a single author throughout this round so far in their last two speeches. You shouldn't let them do it in the third speech, right? Grace and I read this. You didn't say the author specifically, but Grace will get more into that. And second of all, when we talk like about exposure theory, that doesn't necessarily like apply to the Rooney Rule. That's just like psychology. And if Grace and I can show better material impacts that say otherwise, we should win that. But that's time.
Okay, can everybody hear me fine? Okay, cool. With that being said, I'm just going to start on our side of the flow, and I promise I'll signpost from there. Okay. With that being said, I'm going to start my time now. Okay, the big mistake for my opponents, they literally do not warrant you as why, like, Nicole and I don't get durable fiat as a neg. Like, Nicole and I literally can read a counter plan. Like, we are doing civic debate where plans and counter plans are exhibited. Like, as a neg, we literally get durable fiat to have a policy option at the point where they don't tell you why we don't accept that. They just, like, don't like that we read a plan. Like, give us, like, our counter plan. With that being said, let's go line by line. Let's start on our first disadvantage where we talk about tokenization. The really big problem for my opponents is the fact that they literally concede the warranty to tokenization when they respond to it. They said that we have to have the Rooney Rule just to put minorities like in the running and like have them at the table. That is literally the warrant of tokenization that our Collins card talks about, where they're seen as a compliance candidate. They're just being put at the table because they're a minority and they're not actually being considered for the position. We saw this with Nick Saban in 2004. Like, Nicole and I can read you several examples of when this is manifested in the NFL. At that point where they're literally conceding the warrant when they're talking about the Rooney Rule, that's another reason, like another disadvantage as to why you should like vote for the like counter plan. Next, they talk about this like 20% increase, and like this is like their only response saying like we've seen a 20% increase when we've had the Rooney Rule in the NFL. A couple problems here. One, as Nicole tells you in cross-examination, they literally do not card a single piece of evidence. At that point, you're going to prefer two things. One, our Du Bois evidence from 2015 that literally said when we had the Rooney Rule that there was not an increase because there was alt factors that led to it, like how they do assistant coaching. It literally had nothing to do with the fact that they put minorities at the table. But second, or sorry, that's from Solo and not Du Bois. But then second, we tell you in case with like the Solo evidence again, that there is no, when they conclude this empirical study, when they look at the Rooney Rule, that there is not an increase that can be attributed to the rule. It is literally from other factors. At one, the point where I literally warrant why this is true, and I don't just give you a statistic, but two, I card you the evidence and like we extend it throughout the round. You should prefer our evidence off of standards. With that being said, let's go down to our counter plan where we tell you that the alt is that you should hire because this guarantees like material impacts. A couple problems here. One, my opponent tell you that they struck down the Rooney Rule. If we're looking to fiat and like, or if we're looking to like teams don't get fiat because we don't fiat our counter plan, then they just like conceded the fact that it would probably get rolled back if like the ACC already struck down that they don't want the Rooney Rule. If anything, they don't get long-term benefits or they literally don't get fiat power if that's like not existing in this round. But second, also, they literally said that like it's about who can bring the most to the table. Like that's the criteria that they gave you to evaluate this round. That's another reason why we should get a counter plan. Otherwise, like we don't get it all, and like we like Nicole and I like don't have any ground in this debate. With that being said, if you're looking at who can bring the most to the table, Nicole and I get the highest risk of offense. With that being said, I'll get more into that. Let's go to my opponent's side of the flow. First, let's talk about like their first thing where they talk about a standard for hiring practice. As Nicole tells you in her first speech, they only get to fee off the interview. This is really problematic because they must prove that they actually get their foot in the door. At the point where they don't do this and they only read you some sort of like some sort of analysis about why we need to like interview them, they like literally don't get to like have this like risk of solvency towards the latter. It's not a part of their plan. With that being said, let's move on to their second thing where they talk about the ACC and how like schools are being like they were literally built on the back of slaves. Nicole and I will agree with that. With that being said, that's why we need to go one step further and not just interview them and make them compliance candidates like our Collins evidence talks about, but that's why we need to guarantee them jobs. It's literally like mockery at this point where we put them at the table to increase diversity quotas and then we say, but we were going to hire the white candidate anyway, you're just meeting our quota. At that point, that's why we need to hire them. If anything, we like expand the scope of their exposure theory because not just are they talking to one hiring manager, but they're actually infiltrating the ACC and talking to other coaches, talking to students. That's where Nicole and I materialize all of our positive externalities when we talk about our three-layer tier of impacts. That's because they actually like are going into the ACC and they're not just talking to these firms that literally do the hiring for the ACC. With that being said, this is where you're going to look to our Collins evidence from case. It's really specific when you look specifically at the interview process, which is the app, this is where tokenization is warranted. It's because these like minority candidates are literally just compliance candidates. We see this materialize in the status quo. At the point where my opponents tell you specifically we should look to the Rooney Rule and how it was in the NFL, at the point where it like materialized horribly, this is a reason to prefer some sort of alternative. With that being said, go into their like first contention, they talk about more job offers. One, I've said it a million times, look at the example of Nick Saban. Like we actually just like see Collins like theory come true where like minorities are just compliance candidates. Two, it literally fails empirically. Cross-apply our Solo evidence from case, which concludes that there is no impact on hiring when we look at the Rooney Rule in the NFL. They give you this 20% increase, but then Solo gives you the warrant to why this 20% increase is not attributed to the Rooney Rule. Prefer like literally Nicole and I, because we like articulate why like there are other alt factors when you look at how they did their assistant coaching program, which impacts like how head coaches were hired under the Rooney Rule. But next, look at Du Bois in 15 that literally says people of color are hired at a lower rate and held to higher standards when you look at the interviewing process. The problem is in the interviewing process, and that's why they're not getting hired when they're put into the interviews. Du Bois warrants this out. It's because when they look at minority candidates, they hold them to a a higher standard than white candidates, which is why white men are getting the jobs and not these minority candidates. They do not change the interviewing process. With that being said, let's go on to their 20% increase card. One, Nicole and I literally tell you that this has only been 4. We give you evidence at the top of our case from Solo. It's been the same since 2011, when this piece of evidence is from like 2003. There's literally no net benefit. But also, the app works in the status quo, and the neg has the highest risk of offense because we provide some sort of change. With that being said, vote for the neg.
All right, you ready for cross?
Yeah.
All right. What's the material harm of tokenization?
The material harm of tokenization, I mean, like, I don't, like, one, they don't get jobs, like, two, like, we can read you evidence about, like, if they, like, were in jobs, like, in your world, like, the harms of just, like, how they're treated by, like, white counterparts and the lack of diversity in the, like, workforce.
So I mean, definitely we can agree that like not getting a job is non-unique if they're not getting interviewed. So my second question is, are all minority candidates been interviewed under the Rooney Rule token candidates? Every single one?
I mean, if they're like, I can't say like yes or no, because it's not like there was no like people of color and no minorities being interviewed before, but like there definitely was a shift. Like you conceded that they put them at the table under the Rooney Rule. Like you can see that analysis when you get.
What I'm saying is that teams that legitimately went into a job search without a coach already picked out probably gave those minority candidates legitimate consideration, right? That's fair. Do we agree that there are teams that do things like the 2004 Dolphins team did, but you can also agree there are teams that don't know the coach that they want, so they actually consider a minority candidate, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
All right, cool. So in our world, if some Black coaches are actually being considered, which leads necessarily like some of them being hired, wouldn't you like rather have one additional Black coach being hired, even if it means that like 100 candidates have to go in for these like tokenization interviews, as you described them? Like where is the magnitude of impact on your side of this debate?
Wait, one that's like super problematic, because I think you're like boiling down to this debate as like that's how it has to be. Like we can interview 100 Black people and they'll be tokenized, but we got one golden like one that they get the job. Like look, hurrah, the app's doing
No,
so.
I'm just trying to be as charitable as possible. I think that's a very unfair characterization of the world, but I'm just trying to give you guys literally your best case scenario and prove why it still doesn't weigh up against our case.
I'll make it super simple. At the point of the round when there is literally 2 speeches left, and Nicole and I give you warranting from Solo that tells you why your analysis is not true. If you could give me a piece of evidence that says, one, why we've seen an increase in hiring under the Rooney Rule, which you tell us you're looking to, which you have not. If you tell us why that is true, sure, I'll give you your analysis. If you don't, I'm not going to buy your analysis over some economic scholar. Like you said, we're not like statistic people. Like,
Again,
I don't know.
We read evidence in case. Like, sorry I didn't say the author's name. I'm happy to copy and paste the card in the chat. Like, I just don't like the fact this debate has come to. You're just throwing a card at us and literally not engaging with any of the logical warranting we give you in case, right? I think like that is a great summary of the argumentation you provided. Let's move on to this counterpoint example, right? So on whose side of the house do you think it is more likely that a quota system is implemented?
I don't think this is a debate about probability. I literally tell you at the top of case we get durable fiat. Like it's not a probability.
No, here's why I think that you're overlooking, right? I'm going to put aside the fact that I just don't think there's any feasibility of this policy. The second thing that you failed to engage with is the very first thing Nick says at the top of the case. We tell you that it is more likely that the ACC is going to move towards more equitable policy in the future if we begin with the Rooney Rule, right? Like that happened in the NFL. Can you please engage with this analysis because you're yet to do so?
Wait, I'm sorry. Can you like repeat the actual question?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the NFL, the Rooney Rule began a conversation that has continued as the policy has been further expanded since it has passed. We believe on our side of the house, it is more likely that the Rooney Rule is expanded and becomes like a better policy closer to what you're wanting. Why is it not more likely to get the policy you're advocating for on our side of the house?
Okay, like I said, like I don't think this debate's a feasibility debate because I think both teams get fiat power. Like now. But with that being said, like if we do look at feasibility, one, you tell me in case that the ACC already rejected the Rooney Rule. So
here's my issue with that, real quick. We begin this debate by saying that we think it is which side of the house is going to get more minority interview or candidates hired. Then you just like fiat a counterplan that is higher minority candidates. How is that not abusive?
Okay, I'm sorry, that's time. But Nicole and I, we promise she'll address it in the last speech. Thank you.
Cool. Sounds good.
Can everyone hear me? Everyone's ready? We think this debate has come down to two things. First, what are we actually debating about? And secondly, how do we get more diverse hires? We think we've won on both frames. So first, on the question of what are we debating about? Imagine I ask you, should I have a sandwich for lunch? And you respond, no, Nick, you should have caviar instead. This is not like a viable response to me because it goes outside of the realm of this debate. We think Gavin's question in the last crossfire is really important here. We frame this debate as which policies will allow us to get the most diverse hiring. And they come up here and they say, the way we should get more diverse hires is by just hiring more diverse people and forcing institutions to do so. We think the issue is a deeply epistemic one here. That is to say, when I say, should this institution pass this policy, the only way you can say, no, you should not pass this policy because it stops us from doing this other policy is if you prove a couple of things. First, you have to prove these policies are mutually exclusive. That is to say, you have to prove that having a Rooney Rule precludes us in some way from having this quota, whereas that's simply not true. You can have both. You can have to interview at least one minority for every position, and ultimately you have to hire some amount of minority head coaches. They haven't actually proved any reason not to pass the Rooney Rule. They've just also proven we should have this policy, right? We haven't shown that these things are mutually exclusive. The epistemics here are really off. Secondly, that's proof that even if these things do preclude one another, that the alternate is still likely, right? That is to say, if I don't pass a Rooney Rule, that means that it's very likely that something is going to happen that will lead to this quota system that they talk about so much. The issue is whereas they don't show you any evidence, and it's very unlikely that we should, this would actually happen in the status quo, whereas where the ACC is like a fairly conservative group compared to I don't know, some other liberal groups of colleges, and the NCAA has already struck down the Rooney Rule, we see that it's just very unlikely we're going to do something like pass a quota system. All this is to say that when you're discussing the counter plan, we're not saying we just don't like counter plans generally, but they haven't hit the steps that they need in order to prove that we shouldn't pass a Rooney Rule. Remember, the question in this debate is, should we implement effectively a Rooney Rule for ACC schools? We said yes, because we believe it leads to more diverse hires. They say no, because they would rather just hire diverse people. The issue is, once again, they haven't proved that these things are mutually exclusive. In fact, we make them less exclusive when we make it more likely that you get the types of policies that they're talking about on our side of the house. Remember what we've told you in every speech. When you start a conversation and when you start with a policy like the Rooney Rule, you're more likely to expand that policy than if you never had that in the first place. They're skipping a lot of steps here. They want to jump to the final conclusion, which we support in theory a quota. However, we're the only team that lets this happen, right? On to the second point then on this debate, how do we get more diverse hires? The question here can also be boiled down into tokenization versus just the general about tokenization. The issue with their tokenization argument is they don't show you a comparative harm, right? They use tokenization to basically say, we don't actually get more diverse hires on your side of the house. But the issue with that is they don't actually show to you that by having tokenization, this is a reason that the Rooney Rule is bad. They've only proven it is ineffective. Whereas that is true, the easiest place for you to vote on today's round on the merits of the Rooney Rule is just our logic about the way we should be treating diverse hires. Remember, we are institutions that are built on the backs of slaves. This means we ought look at the people we are hiring, and we ought have some rules in some sense. Even if these rules are ineffective, we would rather live in a world where our institutions are making tangible efforts to increase diversity hires than in a world where we have none of that whatsoever. We believe that just the signal list, just starting that conversation is more than enough to win this debate. It's more important than tokenization because tokenization doesn't do any harm. They really don't answer this when Gavin asks. Secondly, we think that we don't even think tokenization is going to be really taking out everything that the Rooney Rule does. The first and clearest analysis that they haven't really responded to here is that when you have a Rooney Rule, this means you provide really important soft skills and professional development to candidates who end up being interviewed. We make diverse candidates just simply more qualified on our side of the house. Even if they are tokenized, this means that they get more soft skills, they get more interview prep, they're able to go forward and maybe get these jobs in the future. We think, secondly, and they concede to this in the crossfire, that it is just simply likely that the types of people who are the types of institutions that are only going to be using minorities as these token candidates are probably on the fringe. That is, in the NFL, we think there are some greatly conservative sports teams that probably only brought in these minorities just to fill the quota, right? We think even in that case that's good because these minorities got some practice and at least they were considered. We can start breaking down racial biases and start considering minority bodies seriously for jobs. But for the vast majority of cases, we think it is likely that these institutions who haven't actually picked out their candidates or haven't actually picked out the head coach that they know they want to hire going into the hiring process, that these institutions are forced to seriously consider at least one minority candidate. What happens when you do this? Why do we think this needs, in our house, there's at least some chance that this minority gets hired, right? We believe that on net, this means that When someone goes into a room and they are forced to be interviewed, and we normalize the practice of interviewing minorities, this means we're more likely to consider those minorities going future. Even if like I end up not hiring a minority this round, the next time I'm doing it, and then like 100th time I'm interviewing, and I've been forced to consider like black and brown bodies the entire time, I'm more likely to actually hire them. This is why the evidence from UChicago shows that within the NFL, and they agree to this, they're going to probably try and bring up the fact that it's like only 4 people, right? But we think that's like pretty statistically significant if we're talking about like 32 open positions. We believe that we've seen in the NFL that just objectively more diverse head coaches have been brought into the fold. That is because we have slowly begun breaking down the systems that have like shut down black and brown bodies for so long. The question here is, I think I would bite the harms of tokenization. Loosely, we can maybe attribute that it like means that black people feel like, or brown bodies feel kind of disenfranchised by the interviewing system. They feel bad that they go in to be a token candidate, right? We're willing to bite that harm with the Rooney Rule because we believe that on our side of the house, having just one black or brown coach is really important for making long-term systemic change. That is to say, when I have one diverse hire that spills over, that leads to more people being hired, it helps us start to undo the like systemic justice. Unless they prove some reasons why tokenism is like a really bad thing that means the Rooney Rule doesn't work, you can't vote for them today. We urge you to affirm.
All right, we're gonna use our, I'm gonna use our 2 minutes of prep starting now. Alrighty, so wait, let's see. Okay, is everybody ready? Okay, I'll start now. Starting off on this kind of idea about this debate about the counter plan. So first of all, my opponents spend a lot of time trying to make it clear to you why Grace and I aren't allowed to run a counter plan, but they don't do it well enough, right? They don't specifically tell you why we like can't run a counter plan. In all of the like events that we have ever done when it comes to debate, like besides public forum, when we talk about parliamentary debate, and when we talk about policy debate and any other kind, even the civic style debate that we've done last year, you are allowed to run a counter plan without any of these like weird nuances that they're to like kind of making it out to be, right? So a few responses to this counter plan though. First of all, they say that like we ignore the warrant and like we don't actually get to the counter plan. And if we do, like in order to win the counter plan, we have to win the feasibility argument. A few things on feasibility. First of all, remember what Grace and I tell you, there is durable fiat when we're talking about the bounds of debate. We are allowed to present a counter plan. They don't really give you a warrant as to why. They say it's because of feasibility. We can't prove it to be true. But second of all, when we talk about feasibility and fiat, you know, we would say that they they themselves don't give themselves any fiat power either, because they say specifically that the ACC doesn't want the Rooney Rule to happen. They have legitimately struck it down within like the last few years, right? So we would say that they don't show that probability either. They're holding us to a really, really high standard that they themselves can't even meet. So I would say it would be way more fair for us to kind of just fiat, so we have like this more educational debate and we can talk about the actual like benefits and harms and what happens, and tokenization, but we'll get more into that. And third of all, they say explicitly that we need to be measuring based on like how much we bring to the table and how many diversity people or like diverse hires we can bring to the table. Grace and I cannot bring diversity hires to the table without interjecting a counter plan. We wouldn't have as much as an educational debate. That's why you should vote for the or you should like at least evaluate the counter plan. But we're going to go ahead and give you more reasons. They say in the very last speech that we need to prove mutual exclusivity. First of all, this should have came in the like earlier speeches, but second of all, we would say that we do prove mutual exclusivity, and that is the tokenization argument. Collins in 07 explicitly tells you why the interview process itself of the Rooney Rule is inherently harmful and causes tokenization. These are our material impacts. We tell you that a compliance candidate is inherently harmful. They say, hey, but it's okay. We get to have like these black, like at least one black person be hired, and that's really good. We would say this feeds right into our narrative. Now, these people, as like Collins says, are used as pawns. They're used to kind of go ahead and lead to this sort of complacency that is not going to lead to any material impact, but they don't even respond to it. They respond to it too late, so you shouldn't give it to them. But then when we talk about Solo, right, they say that tokenization is good if we get people hired. But Solo specifically says that empirically, we can't even prove if these people are being hired in the first place. They don't interact with this. This is one of the reasons that it's going to be really easy to vote for Grace and I, because other factors, Solo says, are probably contributing to this kind of increase in black coaches. Second of all, when they talk about that 60 to 20%, yeah, it sounds like a lot, but you should realize this is like a sort of fallacy trying to like trick you, right? Like we're actually like leading from 2 to 6 isn't even that big of an increase when we just go from like 60 to 20, right? It's materially, we see 6 black NFL like head coaches out of 32, when like the majority of teams are comprised of black black players, right? Statistically, this doesn't make any sense. But going further, like when we talk about what we're going to be talking about the Du Bois evidence specifically. They say the interview process is really, really good because it has people get their foot in the door. First of all, they don't prove that people are actually getting hired because it's not statistically happening. And second of all, Du Bois in 2015 says that the interview process itself is inherently bad, right? Because black coaches are held to this higher standard, especially since they're not being interviewed by like who you think they're being interviewed by. They're being interviewed by these kind of like outside firms that have to kind of do this hiring process. So at the end of the day, for them, it's going to be like they have to prove that hiring happens because of the Rooney Rule, which they never explicitly do. They try to jump around it when Grace and I give you a lot of evidence that says otherwise. And second of all, I would have to say that the interview process is good. We say it's bad, it doesn't actually do anything, and it leads to tokenization. You can see the tokenization argument. We tell you it's really, really bad for a few reasons. First of all, like we said, because they're going to end up as pawns. And Collins says that this has happened before. People end up saying, hey, we're going to hire these, like, we're going to like look at these black people. But in reality, they already made a backdoor deal, right? They're already going to hire white coaches. But then going on to the counter plan explicitly, we would say that this is the reason to vote for us. We go ahead and like reject all, or we can avoid, if you vote for the counter plan, we avoid all of these tokenization harms, right? Because it's not like, oh, we might or may not like have one black coach like they say. We can guarantee these hires. This is really, really good. This is the reason you're going to vote for us, for the 3 reasons that we give you. 1, professional spillover. We're going to see more black coaches in the NFL. 2, political activism. They don't even respond to this as well. Druckmann says that we're likely to have like more student athletes be politically engaged because they feel like they can with black coaches. And 3, more importantly, we're going to be inspiring coaches. We get automatically more benefits. When we get more people being hired, Johnson says that means that we get even more people going ahead and going through this process and inspiring and getting their foot in the door. This is why you're going to vote for the negative at the end of the round, because it's really clear that you're going to vote for Grace and I and reject the affirmative. Good round. I think that's it.
Nice round, y'all.
Great
Thank you
job.
for judging.
Thank you. Wait, do you know if they disclose or do we just keep going?
Yeah, your judges should. I'm just gonna need a few more minutes to some comments, but then yes, good debate. I enjoyed watching it. I always enjoy coming to this tournament. And I have some comments for individuals, kind of some broad comments, and I'll explain how I arrived at a decision for the debate. I assume everyone can hear me okay, right? Okay, great. So some of those general comments that go to anybody include, I think in the future debates that you have today in this format at this tournament, I would encourage you to broaden your examples a bit more to, are we just talking about head coaches here, or are we talking about athletic directors too? There isn't, based on what happened in this debate, I'm not sure what you all think an athletic director is or does, how many of those this new rule may or may not apply to. So I would encourage you to think about that as you encounter other opponents who may have thoughts about whether this new rule would be a good thing or a bad thing. And that seems like half of the topic, that it's about coaches and athletic directors. My second thought is similar to that one, which is, if the resolution is about all of Division I sports, then I think this debate focuses a lot, maybe unnecessarily, on football, because there are a variety of other sports that would hire head coaches and athletic directors. And I think some of your opponents will have thoughts about the other sports in addition to football, or other comparisons to be made than just the NFL. So those are some broad thoughts that I had some sort of question marks when I thought, what will I hear a debate about today? And then there was a hyper focus on football and on coaches, which maybe neglects the other part of the topic. Some other thoughts I had include, I think everybody could work on removing some of the debate jargon for these debates, including on our side of the house, including affirmative ground, durable fiat, counterplan. All of those kinds of words are words perhaps we're all familiar with in here, and maybe that I'm familiar with from my own format, but it's not to say that all of the judges who you'll have will be. And there are other ways to talk about those concepts without using the specialized language. So I know it's hard to remove those from our speeches, and we're so used to them at other tournaments, but I would try to get rid of those. So comments for particular people. I wrote some comments for all four of you. Nick, I think that you already mentioned removing some jargon. I think that one thing you did really well is the speed that you're going at is, I think, appropriate for this style of tournament, as well as the volume. I do think that you can, maybe when reading evidence, and some of this came up in the debate, is like, maybe in whatever debate format you're familiar with, it's customary to say things like studies show. And I think maybe you would be better served by sharing more about, well, where is the research from? And audiences, non-specialized ones and specialized ones, could appreciate, okay, well, when is the research from? Tell us the publish year, or tell us the author or the sponsor, so that we know who this research is from, a bit more than studies show. Nicole, I think your vocal variety and enthusiasm and emphasis to make certain words stand out was really appropriate for a format and tournament like this one, especially for early morning debates. I think maybe in your format you're familiar with, it's appropriate to say this author, last name, and this date, and that's a citation format I'm familiar with too. I think you're expressing where evidence is from would benefit from sharing the credentials of the author, especially for non-technical audiences. So instead of like Solo in 2011 or Harvey in 12, you might want to say who those people are and what field they're from, maybe things about why the recency might matter on a subject like that. I think that Gavin, your vocal variety also and enthusiasm and body movement is really appropriate for a tournament like this one. I think that one thing that might help facilitate better body movement or maybe eye contact is if you angle where your camera is positioned, because it looks like you're looking over to the right, and maybe that's where you have some notes or something else, but that means that you're almost never facing the camera or audience. And that's a weird part of virtual presentations, but I think it would really help with the presentations and speeches that you give over a video in the future. Similarly, about evidence reading, I definitely heard the piece about the 6 to 20% figure. I think you should say in the speech where you got that from. And it comes out later in the cross-examination period, but maybe your opponent next time won't ask about it in the cross-examination period. So it'd be useful for the judge to know during the speech. So everybody can kind of work on the pieces of how am I to express where my evidence is from in a way that's digestible to the judge. Grace, I think for you, the speed is a little fast for this format, but the enthusiasm and vocal variety is there, which I appreciated. I think that you do have a lot of arguments grounded in research. One way I might talk about a counterplan differently is not calling it a counterplan and instead calling it, look, what we've presented here is appropriate argument selection for non-expert audiences, since that is the directive that you are given in the language of the invitation here. So you'd want to say, look, non-experts compare policy choices all the time. It's just called option thinking. If we're all here to deliberate outcomes to increase minority participation in leadership positions, we have an idea as well, but it is not requiring at least one candidate to come to the interview. That's not the rule that we think is a good one. So I think instead of, going back and forth about what is durable fiat, what's affirmative ground, what is available on our side of the house, questions of feasibility, everybody could talk about it. Everybody could get the same ideas across, just using different language choices. So I hope those comments were helpful. How I ended up deciding the debate, I thought it was very close, and I thought both sides could have, easily changed how I decided. But I ended up deciding to vote affirmative for Duke, and that's because when I asked myself the question at the end of the debate, should the ACC adopt this new rule, I said yes, and I thought that the last negative rebuttal, the main reason not to, was this tokenization argument. And I kind of agreed with the affirmative characterization that this is more of a reason that the rule implemented may fail to produce an immediately large percentage of new diverse hires, but not that it would be a harmful thing. So I think to win the negative argument that tokenization and the interview process outweighs, you would need to expand the argument that the interview process means it's bad because they're pawns. And I think you can do that by finding some research, maybe from the fields of psychology, that says it's not just that they're pawns, but it is psychologically harming and traumatic to mental health for them to have to go through interview after interview and usually never get the job. So I think it's sort of taken for granted that it is a bad thing, and it could be better supported with, it's not just that it would fail, because it would be better to still try even if it might fail, but that it would be actively bad to make them go through the interview process. And then you can compare that to the reasons the affirmative says, no, that interview process is actually quite beneficial, even if they never get the job, because their professional development would benefit from going through interview after interview, and being selectively exposed to certain groups makes people who perhaps are racist less racist over time because of the exposure theory argument. And then the last thing I'll say was that I think that last negative rebuttal spends a lot of time defending that you get a counter plan and why you don't need to debate feasibility questions, but not enough time on the actual what is the counter plan and what are the benefits of it. Because if you only have 6 minutes and then at 59 seconds is when you started saying, let me remind you what the counter plan is and what its net benefits are, that's not a lot of time. So I think you should be more dismissive of the question of, do you get one? And more about, we get one, and here is what ours is. And I'm going to now compare it to what their option is. Because I think that judges will not just like discount that you get one. And I think they more want to hear, here's why ours is better than theirs. And you probably can't do both at the same time. Again, great debate, everyone. Yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask. I'm not sure when the next debate starts, but I'm sure there is at least a little bit of time.
I just have a quick question, sorry. For, I guess, like the last, like how you viewed the round, you didn't like vote off of who gets more hires, but like the net benefits of interviewing.